And so that was how Roxana spent her first days in Yggdrasil, cooped up in her room. A maid entered and inquired if Roxana would be staying in her room once again, as there were many people who sought out an audience with her. Roxana, however, was not thrilled at all to meet new faces, as she noted that none of them appeared desperate enough for her attention. And from below her private balcony, she heard many voices as they took in the sight of Roxana, many of whom were captivated by her beauty. But Roxana only noted one presence in the crowd, and that was the heir of the Castro family, one of the male protagonists of the novel, Luzark. And he was the only one she'd managed to see in person at the previous assembly. She recalled their first encounter. She'd stood in the hall, sipping on a glass of champagne, bored out of her mind as she thought about the families that would attend the assembly, with the exception of the Goldversiums, as they'd not attended in the many years prior. She also recalled the white Fapelians who had the ability to communicate with demonic creatures. Orca of the Fapelian family was also known as the White Demon Tamer because he spent most of his time chasing after a demonic creature that only becomes active during winter. Therefore, he'd never attended the annual assembly. It was then that a particular person had drawn her attention. With flaming red hair and sharp amethyst-colored eyes, Roxana recognized Luzark Castro immediately. She took in his large frame, noting that the novel's description of his attractiveness did him no justice. As if feeling her gaze, he glanced at Roxana and stopped abruptly. Unfazed by his actions, Roxana smiled demurely, and her smile caught Luzark off guard for a moment before he scowled in displeasure. And with not a word more, he passed Roxana. But Roxana understood his strange behavior because the novel had mentioned Luzark's fear of women. And now once again, she was the object of his frustration as he cast another glare her way, though she was unsure what she'd done to earn his ire. Jeremy approached the man with a glare of his own as he questioned the man for glaring at his sister. "Do you have a death wish?" he threatened. Luzark was not one to shy away from confrontation, as he guessed that by the boy's arrogant attitude, he was one of the aggressors. But Jeremy grew more agitated as he warned the man to drop his gaze from Roxana lest he show the man what his attitude truly entails. Roxana recognized that this was Jeremy's way of acting out as a result of his boredom. However, Luzark's reaction surprised her the most since she hadn't expected him to rise to Jeremy's taunts. He spoke through gritted teeth as he warned, "Say another word, and I'll cut off your tongue." Roxana felt it was time to intervene, and so she ordered Jeremy to return to her side. He let out a petulant noise, but did as she said. She apologized to the man on behalf of her brother, and Luzark let out a derisive snort. She explained that Jeremy only lashed out at people who treated her poorly, and usually, he was very adorable. She explained all that with a smile, but Luzark's eyes only narrowed in a glare. She turned away, ready to be done with their encounter, but not before she left him with her parting words. She'd hoped that they would get along since that was the purpose of the assembly, and with that, she bid him farewell. And as she left, Luzark's eyes never left her retreating figure. And later, as she sat by the table, a maid informed her that the head of the Goldversiums as well as the Blue Pedelians had arrived. Roxana sighed, for at last the female protagonist had arrived. And so she entered the ballroom with her father ahead of her. Soon enough she caught sight of Silver Hair, but Lant drew her attention as he was only interested in one person. He let loose a smirk as Roussel Pedelian approached. Roxana kept to etiquette and bowed in greeting to the older man, but Roussel's attention went to Lant. "It's been a while," he said. "Your face disgusts me as always." He smiled viciously, but Roussel matched his glare as he stated the feeling was mutual. Lant noted that Roussel had finally brought his daughter along with him this year, and he wondered the reason for it. Roussel clenched his fists tightly in restraint at the sudden mention of his daughter from the despicable man. Roxana was surprised by Lant's audacity. She was sure that Roussel was overly protective of his daughter as a result of his son's kidnapping, so to defuse Roussel's anger, Roxana noted aloud that the blue heir had yet to make an appearance this year as well. But Roussel explained calmly that he would be arriving later, to which Lant released a loud scoff. He noted that Roussel had used the same excuse for the last 3 years. He mocked Roussel as he stated how busy a person his son appeared to be. Roussel glared at Lant, but Roxana quickly stepped in as she expressed her eagerness to meet him. Lant stepped forward, and as he passed Roussel, he voiced his own interest in the blue air. Lant walked away with Roxana in tow as Roussel failed to say a word. Lant ridiculed him as he said, "Moron." He wondered how he intended to bring his son to the assembly when he no longer existed. Roxana smirked as she was sure that it was nothing but a laughable performance, and Lant laughed softly, sure his daughter was right. The day drew on, and soon, the banquet was underway. Many fell under the spell of the female protagonist's beauty as she made her way through the room. However, Jeremy was quite disgusted with her appearance as she resembled her brother, and on the other side, Luzark's glare remained in place as he watched the silver-haired female amble through the room. Roxana watched all this through the butterfly that sat atop her eye, and she noted that contrary to the novel, the female protagonist wasn't as alluring as portrayed. She was sure Jeremy had gone to the banquet hall to see what Sylvia looked like, and from what she gathered, he didn't appear to have fallen in love with her. As the butterfly fluttered away, she flopped down on the sofa, exhausted. Taking control of the butterflies in Yggdrasil had taken its toll on her. From the butterflies she'd planted in the banquet hall, she surmised that Sylvia was the talk of the day. Her uncanny appearance reminded Roxana of Cassis, and she recalled their last encounter as he'd vowed to meet her again. She got up and headed to the door, hoping the cold night air would clear away her unsettling thoughts. And as she strolled along the concrete walkway, she regretted her choice of thin garments. She stopped when she noted that she'd unknowingly made her way to Roussel Padelian's room, and from the light that shone within, he appeared to be awake, and she wondered what occupied him at 4 o'clock in the morning. But then again, she herself walked in the stillness at this time of morning. She made her way to the tree she'd spotted last year. It was a poisonous plant that she'd discovered, and it surprised her that it was still living. It wasn't strong enough to induce anything worse than stomach aches, though. She let out a sigh of relief as she took comfort in the familiar plant in such a foreign place. She sat on the ground and hugged her knees as she thought about the novel. The female protagonist had just turned 18 years old, and originally, this should have been where the story started, if not for Roxana's interference. She smiled as she anticipated the look on Lant's face when he would first lay eyes on Cassis, who would be alive and well. Light footsteps caught her attention, and she looked to see a figure in a jet-black robe approach her. After some thought, she was sure it was Dion. His physical appearance, although shrouded in a cloak, had the build of her well-recognized brother, for she'd never seen anyone that tall and well-built aside from Dion. She watched him from a nearby tree, in disbelief that he'd actually made it to the assembly since she'd given him quite the difficult mission to keep him away. And with that thought in mind, she decided to ignore his existence. The man in question, however, wouldn't let her as he stopped a few feet away from her spot behind the tree. And Roxana knew instantly that she'd been spotted. Her voice was laden with annoyance at having been found as she sighed out, "You're the worst. How much more do I have to put up with from you?" She questioned, and her words seemed to freeze him in place. She expressed her dislike for him and how his appearance had ruined her nice, quiet evening. And so she ordered him to leave immediately. She hadn't bothered to spare the man a glance, and she hadn't noticed him approach until the cloak fell across her shoulders. But what surprised her even more was the scent that clung to it. It was a scent she'd recognized, and when she whirled around to look at him, the man was gone. And now Roxana was even more sure that the man was not Dion at all. A new day was upon them, and soon Roxana accompanied her father as he questioned the whereabouts of Dion. She informed Lant that he'd not arrived yet, to which the man grew annoyed at his son's tardiness. To ease her father's ire, she assured Lant with a smile that Dion was sure to be at the banquet. And as we expected by now, Lant gave his full trust to Roxana's words. The doors were soon upon them, and upon stepping through, all eyes were on the Agrises' entrance as if they'd anticipated their arrival. Many men blushed as they laid eyes upon Roxana's beauty, and Jeremy scoffed at their obvious desire for his sister. Roxana was used to such scrutiny. However, The eyes of one man in particular stole her attention, and that was Luzark Castro. He glared at Roxana as usual, which was no surprise to her. But voices near the closed doors drew the attention of everyone in the hall, and as they entered, the blonde man clung to the silver-haired man, much to his annoyance. Roxana watched them, sure the blonde man was none other than Noel of the Gold Vertiums. He appeared just as the book described him, to which Roxana was relieved, as at least that much hadn't changed. His companion dragged Noel through the crowded room, but Noel's eyes snagged on Roxana as they passed. A gentle smile curved her lips, and the sight stole the strength from Noel's legs. He slumped to the floor, and his companion panicked, unsure if his master was injured. But Noel couldn't look away from Roxana, and soon blood trickled from his nose, but Noel hardly felt anything, still lost in Roxana's gaze. The man grabbed Noel by the arms and hurriedly dragged him from the room. Jeremy appeared at Roxana's side, and as he handed her a drink, he scoffed at the spectacle that was Noel, but soon bombarded Roxana with an array of questions as he wondered if she'd like something to eat and quickly ran off, eager to feed his beloved sister. Roxana watched his retreating figure, plagued by fathomless anxiety. But no, that wasn't the right word to describe her feelings. She felt agitated, as if waiting for something to happen. And when the doors opened once again, she realized the cause of her feelings. Roussel Padelian entered, and behind him, his daughter Lydia. But what sent shockwaves across the banquet was the appearance of the Padelian heir, Cassis Padelian, for this was his first appearance in 3 years. But no one was more shocked at his appearance than Lant, for he was sure he'd witnessed the boy's very death 3 years ago by the hands of none other than his own daughter. He crushed the glass in his hand. Red liquid spilled onto the floor. How is he alive? He spat it out from stiff lips. Jeremy rushed to his sister's side as the crowd murmured about the blue air. Jeremy too couldn't hide his shock, sure that wasn't the real Cassis Padelian. But Roxana was more concerned about Lant's reaction than anything else. But all too soon, she turned away, ready to leave as she called out to Jeremy. But Roxana stopped as she locked eyes with Cassis. All sound dimmed as their gazes held steadfast, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the ticking of the clock. It was as if the time that had frozen when they'd parted that night now started running again. But Lant's anger was too much to contain, and as they left the hall, his frustration was apparent as he cursed aloud his confusion, and Roxana tried to calm him down. She confirmed that Cassis had indeed died by her hands, and that Lant had witnessed the entire act. But when Lant did not look convinced, she theorized that the Cassis that they'd seen must have been some sort of imposter. Her words shocked Lant, and he wondered if that was the truth. He couldn't understand why the blue Padelian gave off the same aura. Roxana noted Noel's appearance not far behind them, and an idea formed in her mind. She explained to Lant that maybe the blue Padelian was something else since they knew people who had the ability to create living dolls that replicated real humans. And at her words, Lant froze in his tracks as he questioned if the blue heir was none other than a puppet. She leaned close as she softly reminded Lant of the little information she'd shared. The Padelians had been interacting with the Vertiums, and while they'd found out this only recently, they might have been exchanging words in secret long before. The blue heir had had much attention on him, and so they'd had to stay quiet for the past 3 years. And in those years, they'd created a doll that looked just like Cassis Padelian. Lant gazed at Roxana with sharp eyes and in an instant determined that his daughter must be right. He would meet with the Vertium heir immediately, and Roxana smiled at her father as she gave her best wishes. She smirked, for she knew her father believed every sweet lie that floated from her lips. But Lant was quickly forgotten as her hand was grabbed, and she was roughly trussed up against the wall. She let out a tired sigh. She said as much to Dion. But he only squeezed her hand in answer as he gazed at her with hard eyes. He discerned that Cassis had decided to show his face to the world once again, and he questioned, "Well, were you glad to see him?" His displeasure was apparent, and as Roxana watched the blood drip from his left hand, she smiled a satisfied smile as she said, "You already know my answer, don't you?" She found it quite amusing at Dion's unusual emotional state. But Dion didn't share in her mirth as he squeezed her hand harder. His gaze turned to stone as he expressed softly his urge to take her life. But their conversation was interrupted by Cassis, and as he approached them, he noted how inappropriate Dion's behavior was, especially as the assembly was held as a sign of harmony between families. And so he asked disapprovingly, "Is that how you Greece men treat women?" Roxana watched Cassis in silence, glad that Lant wasn't present because if he were, he'd never know that this Cassis wasn't the real blue heir. Dion turned and took a step towards Cassis, surely to retaliate in violence, but Roxana's voice stopped him as she called out his name. His shrewd eyes turned on her, and after a moment, he turned and walked away without another word. Roxana, ever the actress, thanked Cassis for his help, and she introduced herself with a smile and prompted, "And you are?" He bowed and he introduced himself. "The blue heir, I'm pleased to meet you." To any passerby, they'd think this was their first meeting. However, their eyes told a different story. They looked at each other with warm, knowing gazes. He extended a hand as he asked softly, "Please, allow me to greet you properly." She placed her hand in his with pleasure, and it was there he laid a gentle kiss atop Roxana's hand. Cassis didn't let go immediately, and as his eyes met hers once again, it was there where 1,000 words were exchanged in the mere seconds their eyes stayed locked on each other. But when she withdrew her hand, the spell was broken, and they were once again strangers. She noted how prestigious his position as the blue heir was, and she apologized for the quarrel he'd witnessed between siblings, so she asked that he please forget whatever he saw. Cassis only responded with a vague acknowledgement and soon fell silent. But Roxana felt it was time to wrap up their meeting and turned as she gave words of departure in a soft voice. She wished him a wonderful night and turned to leave, but stopped as Cassis draped his suit jacket over her shoulders as he noted how cold it was out. It was there he told her there was no need to return it, likewise with the coat from the other night. And with those words, Cassis walked away. She watched his retreating figure with inscrutable eyes, and all the while she clutched at his coat tighter. But she was soon approached by Noel's aide and, with a blushing red face, offered her the bouquet of flowers, which he explained was from his master, Noel. She accepted the flowers as she passed on her thanks, and as she walked away, the aide frantically called out to her. But Roxana paid him no mind, for her thoughts lay elsewhere. With the arrival of Cassis's appearance, she knew it was time for the show to begin. She headed for her father, and as she entered the room, Roxana informed him that they were to return home at once, as she'd heard from Dion that Fontaine had staged a rebellion while they'd been away. Her words infuriated Lant, more so since he'd had yet to meet with the Vertium head. He ordered their return immediately. And as the Agreses left in their carriage, a guard shared this information with Cassis, who questioned, "Is everything ready?" To which the guard responded that all preparations had been completed. Cassis donned his coat, ready to leave, but a voice called out to him, and that voice belonged to his beloved sister, Sylvia. She appeared out of breath as she said softly, "Be careful." Cassis promised to return once everything was done, and ordered that she stay with their father. He laid a gentle hand on her head in adoration. And as he walked away, Cassis's eyes turned sharp once more in determination, for he would be returning to the place they'd first met. Upon their arrival, Lant burst out of the carriage in a fit of fury as he shouted loudly, "Bring me Fontaine. I want him at my feet in the judgment room." Their unexpected arrival filled the crowd with unease, and they wondered what trouble Fontaine had caused to go to the judgment room. Roxana understood the tension surrounding the judgment room, for it was a room where criminals were executed. And it was in this room where Lant determined a sentence for the guilty according to the weight of their crime. It was also a room where he dealt out punishment with his own hands. To Roxana, this room was especially memorable because it was where Achilles' dead body was discarded. They made their way through the corridors, and it was there that they passed Griselda. Roxana whispered if everything was ready, to which her sister confirmed that it was. Their exchange was brief enough that it had gone undetected, and Roxana soon let loose her hallucinatory butterflies, and thus her plan began. She handed their current area to Jeremy, which he happily accepted. They entered the room of judgment, and it was there that Dion joined them. And just as he'd commanded, Fontaine was thrown at Lant's feet, bound and confused. He tried to explain this terrible misunderstanding. However, Lant didn't give him a chance as he dealt a hard blow to Fontaine's head with his cane. Fontaine fell to the floor, disoriented as Lant spewed venom at his eldest son, furious at his betrayal. "Did you really think I would have no clue about your plot against me?" Lant shouted as he let loose a fury of blows on his son. Fontaine was sure that his plan had gone unnoticed, and he wondered who had betrayed him. And when Lant paused in his torture to briefly light a cigar, Fontaine spotted Dion over Lant's shoulder, and just seeing his brother's face convinced Fontaine that he'd been discovered through one of Dion's investigations. Fontaine got back on his knees as he pleaded with his father, sure this was all a setup by Dion. But Lant was unconvinced as he explained that it was he that had Dion watch Fontaine the minute he'd gathered troops without Lant's knowledge. This news stunned Fontaine, for that meant Lant had discovered his plan from the very start. Lant grabbed him by the cravat and dragged him closer as Lant questioned if he should list all of Fontaine's schemes he'd discovered. His hand struck out, landing a blow to Fontaine's cheek as he chided his son, for he'd given Fontaine many chances to prove himself, but it had all been for naught as Fontaine had instead decided to treat Lant like a fool. And in a weighty voice that alarmed Fontaine, Lant ordered, "Bring it here." The servant handed the Agrease head a sword. He stomped on Fontaine's hand, immobilizing him as Lant questioned the whereabouts of the soldiers he'd gathered, but Fontaine looked at his father in confusion, for he didn't understand what he referred to, and as he tried to explain, he instead stifled the shriek of pain. For Lant had severed the hand he'd stepped on, and Lant praised his son for his silence, just as he'd taught Fontaine. And when he raised his sword to cut off another limb, he stopped as Roxana called out to him. She advised him to save his energy, and Lant, who assumed his reliable daughter had already found the stolen troops, praised her for her efforts. But Roxana's next action stunned Lant into silence. She climbed the stairs that led up to the dais, and it was there that she took a seat on the throne, Lant's throne. His eyes turned fierce as he questioned in a low voice, "What are you doing, Roxana?" But Roxana smiled her usual smile as she mused about the feeling of sitting in that seat and gazing at the people below, a feeling she'd always wondered about. Smile still in place, she said cheerfully, "From up here, you look very small, father." Lant's anger erupted in a flurry of movements as he raised his sword once more, ready to strike down Roxana, but she let out a soft giggle as she finally revealed her own schemes against her father. Her hallucinogenic butterflies revealed themselves as they fluttered around Lant, and below him appeared a magic circle. Lant looked on, stunned and silent, as Roxana explained that all she'd done up until now was part of a play she set up just for him. Roxana was astounded by the amount of trust Lant had put in her. Going by the sheer surprise on his face, he'd never suspected Roxana had ulterior motives. But soon Lant exploded in anger, but as he tried to move, he found himself unable to. He coughed hard as a rush of blood fell from his lips. The pain was almost unbearable. It was no doubt because of the hidden magic circle beneath him. Sure, it had activated when he'd spilled Fontaine's blood, and he knew now this was all part of Roxana's plan. He fell, his legs unable to support him any longer, for the pain coursed through his body. Fontaine backed away, surprised at the turn of events, but Roxana paid him no mind, her focus trained on her father. She recalled the lesson she'd learned from the very man on the ground, that love and trust between family members were nothing but an illusion, but even she had to applaud her stellar acting. Her words angered Lant, but he could do nothing, and so he ordered his son, Dion, who had stood by silently all this time, to take down Roxana. But Roxana called out to her brother and motioned him forward with a flick of her finger. And without hesitation, Dion walked up the steps and gently grasped Roxana's hand. Lant realized instantly that he'd been betrayed by Dion as well, but before he could say anything, Jeremy burst into the room, an apology on his lips for his dear sister, but it soon died on his lips as he took in the room and questioned, "What's going on here?" Lant looked at his younger son for help, but that soon disappeared as Jeremy shouted out in fury for Dion to let go of Roxana's hand, for they were his to hold. Jeremy leaped off the ground and onto the dais beside Dion, and he smacked Dion's hand away. Roxana smiled a satisfied smile as she informed her father that everyone in the Agris family had deceived him, but as Jeremy rested his head on her lap, she assured her father that they'd keep him alive for now, for he might prove useful later. And with Dion and Jeremy at her side, she smiled benignly at her father. While Roxana toyed with the Agris head, the Pedelian troops hid amongst the barren trees and snow-covered ground, their eyes trained on the Agris stronghold before them. One soldier greeted his master, Cassis, and he dropped an unconscious Agris soldier onto the ground as he questioned, "How is everything going?" The soldier explained that they heard a lot of noise from inside the estate, and the soldier questioned if this was the right time to make their move. Cassis was sure that the noise meant that Roxana had already made her move and, after a moment's pause, ordered that they wait and observe a little longer. And back at one of the smaller annexes, Roxana's mother gasped at the words her maid had uttered. She'd explained that Dion had revolted and now Lant Agris was imprisoned. Sierra felt a tremor of pure terror roll through her body because she knew somewhere deep inside that Dion was a mere puppet following the whimsical orders of the true mastermind, her daughter, Roxana. She feared for her daughter's life, and so she got up, ready to go see her, but her attendant stopped her with a loud shout. She worried it was too dangerous for her lady to be out, but Sierra was determined to leave. But before she could take a single step, a knock on the door rang out. Both women grew alarmed, and the attendant urged Sierra to get behind her. But Sierra stepped forward and opened the door and widened her eyes in surprise upon discovering her visitor. While Sierra met her mysterious visitor, back at the main mansion, Griselda marveled at the chaos as she watched from a small balcony above. She giggled at the frantic movements of the Agris soldiers, knowing full well their search would end in vain. She recalled a memory as a younger Roxana had asked her, "Do you like fun things?" For she promised to show Griselda the most interesting scene she'd ever witness. And with a beautiful smile, she'd asked Griselda to draw a magic circle. Griselda recalled the promise she'd made with 12-year-old Roxana. She'd drawn an intricate magic circle, which was something not everyone could accomplish, for magic circles required the finest details to be perfect. And looking back, she wondered why no one had ever realized that they were mere pawns in Roxana's hand, herself included. But she'd chosen this path plainly for survival, just as her father had taught her and her kin. Love had no place in the Agris family. She smiled. Sure, they would hold a grand celebration to commemorate this event. And in the punishment room, the Agris children had bound and trapped their father in a cage. Roxana smiled as she took in the sight and told him how good he looked in shackles, but recalled that Lant couldn't respond as unbearable pain silenced him, caused by Roxana's beloved poisoned butterflies. And it was here that Roxana revealed her true thoughts. She told him how she'd despised looking at his disgusting face all these years and about the many ways she'd wanted to humiliate him before his death. But for a long time she'd pondered what would cause him greater pain than death. She assured him that her butterflies wouldn't kill him yet, and as she flung her arms wide, a radiant smile on her face, she asked Lant to stay alive a little longer for what she had planned. And on the other side of the mansion, Jeremy dropped the severed head onto the ground, and his actions stunned many of the Agris children. They stepped back, wary as he explained that he'd wanted to rip off the man's head for a while now. Jeremy recalled his small, trembling frame as the looming figure threatened to get rid of him if he failed the test. The memory flooded Jeremy with fiery anger, and he wanted to kill the man all over again. One of the children worried about the repercussions now that Jeremy had disposed of their teacher. But Jeremy, in his usual brisk voice, explained that Lant couldn't do anything because he was in the punishment room, being tortured. Jeremy informed his half-siblings that anyone was allowed in and soon he'd be headed that way too. He smiled gleefully at the thought of Lant being a mess and hoped that there was some of him left for Jeremy to have his turn too. He turned that smile their way as he taunted, "Don't you feel wronged? We were terrorized by the teachers and executors for our entire childhood." He manipulated the children skillfully into doing his bidding. He saw the bloodlust and anger form in their eyes, and he asked cheerfully, "So, who wants to go kill the remaining ones with me?" News of Lant's capture had reached the concubines, and they panicked. One suggested they go to Dion, but worried they might end up in the punishment room alongside Lant. Another suggested they gather their children and hide. Charlotte's mother gnawed on her nail, anxious. Charlotte headed for the door, and her mother shouted out for her to stop as she needed to be protected. Charlotte scowled at her mother as she explained that Jeremy had summoned all the children. She shot her mother a pointed look as she told her that she'd needed to save herself, for she'd never done so for Charlotte. Everyone froze as they realized that their children wouldn't protect them since they'd never protected their children from any danger, and Charlotte said as much. She turned away, and as she sprinted down the stairs, Charlotte realized that Roxana had finally taken control of the Agris family. And under Jeremy's control, the Agris children went on a killing spree. They smiled and laughed as they took out the many teachers that had terrorized them throughout the years. They treated it almost like sport as they counted their kills. But the person with the most kills under his belt was Jeremy. He stood, splattered blood covered his clothes and many bodies lay at his feet. It was here that Griselda approached and relayed her message. She handed him a small bag, and Roxana ordered him to light it up in Maria's room. Jeremy looked at the bag and wondered why Roxana had given such an order since everyone knew that Maria was surely asleep by now. But Griselda didn't know the workings of Roxana's mind and informed Jeremy that he was to send all the maids to the annex too. Jeremy narrowed his eyes in suspicion but said nothing. Roxana sat in her father's study, a glass of bourbon in hand. A silver of light illuminated the room as the door opened to reveal Dion. "I never said you could enter," Roxana said, but he walked in anyway. He approached her slowly, and she smiled in concession since she was in a good mood. She offered Dion a drink, but he declined the well-aged whiskey, which Roxana thought was a great shame. It was then he noticed the coat draped across her shoulders, and his eyes turned sharp once more. It was the coat that had been given to her by Cassis during their encounter back in Yggdrasil. Roxana saw his interest and explained as much. She hugged the coat to her body as she told Dion how fond she was of that coat since it was a gift from Cassis. Dion remained impassive save for the twitch in his right eye that revealed the anger he felt at her words. Roxana taunted him as she usually did and smiled in amusement at Dion's reaction. But the words he spoke next were to taunt Roxana, she was sure. "I don't regret killing Achille," he said. He told her that he'd slit Achilles' throat without hesitation before her very eyes again if he could, and now it was Roxana's turn to remain unfeeling. Dion grabbed her by the hand as he wondered how devastated she'd be if she'd witnessed Achilles' true death. And it was at the thought of Roxana's despair that Dion smiled. Dion let go of her hand, and Roxana looked away, hoping she'd hidden her emotions quick enough. She wouldn't admit it, but the sight would bring her to her knees once more. He told her his only regret was that he couldn't kill Achille once more, and now he'd entertained the idea of killing Sierra in front of her. But he knew that Roxana had already anticipated his thoughts, and that was why she'd asked Maria, Dion's mother, to protect her. Roxana turned away as she noted that they'd had a lot in common since they'd struggled for survival. She'd always thought that she'd wanted to avoid the same fate as Achille, but now she thought otherwise. She walked to the window, hardly believing that she'd ever reveal her true thoughts to Dion, the man she despised. And she knew the simple reason for this was because she now sat on their father's throne. She told Dion that she'd wanted to survive because she'd had a dream. She looked at him with clear eyes as she questioned, "Do you know what I want?" She didn't need to elaborate, for Dion knew, and so he questioned if she would give him what he wanted if he made her dream a reality. And although Roxana gave no verbal answer, Dion took the look in her eyes as agreement. He turned and left, and Roxana walked to the window, determined to finish her end as well. And it was on her way that she encountered the first traitor. He froze at the sound of her voice. Roxana questioned where he was going, and he quickly turned, the note hidden. She told him that that wasn't the way to where the employees were gathered, and he stuttered out an excuse, claiming illness. But Roxana knew, and soon the man grew dizzy, the closer she got, eventually falling to the ground, unconscious and foaming at the mouth, a clear sign of poison. But he was not dead, merely subdued, and she assured his unconscious form that once he awoke, everything would be over. She took the note, tooting at the fact that her father had chosen a servant with no poison tolerance. And how desperate he must have been since all his loyal servants were dead. She told Lant countless times that her entire body had become poisonous, but it seemed he'd chosen not to listen. The note was addressed to Lord Vertium, and Lant requested troops as soon as possible as repayment for the favor he had done. She turned at the sound of her name, and Jeremy approached, a frown marring his face at Roxana out in the cold without a coat. But his attention soon went to the twitching man on the floor, and he informed her that he'd locked up all the employees in the annex. She smiled in satisfaction as he wrapped her up in his coat, and Roxana asked Jeremy to take this man to the other employees as well, and Jeremy quickly accepted the order. Jeremy didn't understand most of Roxana's actions and simply didn't care if he was honest. He chose to only follow her orders. He hauled the man onto his shoulder and, with a smile, walked away. She glanced at the letter once again as she thought about the favor Lant had granted to Vertium, and she wondered if this had taken place at the assembly. But she soon discarded that thought, for Lant was suspicious of the Vertiums at the time with the appearance of Cassis. She stopped abruptly as she realized that this was not a concern for her. She turned towards the sconce on the wall and set the note ablaze. The charred paper fluttered behind Roxana as she walked off, symbolizing her unconcerned nature now that Lant was in her grasp. They'd made sure to restrain Fontaine, and they chained him up in the dungeon. And it was there where he hadn't ceased his incessant whining. He'd noted the eerie quietness, and he wondered if Lant had been tortured to death. He pulled at his chain, and he tried to grab at it with the hand that was no longer there thanks to dear old Dad. Fontaine knew that by taking down Lant, they'd inadvertently saved him from an even harsher punishment. He grinned, sure that once he escaped his chains, he could flee. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and they belonged to none other than Dion. He'd come, but not for Fontaine. No, he'd come for Lant. Fontaine scoffed at Dion's disrespect, noting now he referred to Lant by name. He told Dion that Lant was either dead or had escaped. Fontaine theorized that now that Dion had used him to take over as head of the family, there was no need to keep him hostage. He smiled as he explained that he'd never had any intention to take over as head of the family. He'd merely been a pawn in Roxana's schemes, Fontaine claimed. He promised to leave the family if Dion let him go, but Dion interrupted Fontaine's declarations as he said, "You must be mistaken. Do you really think you can stop me from getting what I want? You never did and you never will." Dion's words angered Fontaine, but he suppressed it and with a controlled voice asked Dion to let him go. He gave various reasons as to why he posed no threat to Dion or his new position, but Dion continued to stare at Fontaine with unblinking eyes, a stare that unnerved Fontaine. And, unable to help himself, he asked what Dion's thoughts were. Dion smiled for the first time since entering the room as he said, "I'm thinking about whether or not I should kill you right now." Fontaine froze, unsure he'd heard Dion right, for he believed that he'd been on the verge of convincing Dion to let him go. Dion stepped forward as he told Fontaine of his dislike for him. And what Dion did next stunned Fontaine, for he grabbed the iron gate and tore it apart with his bare hands. His red eyes seemed to glow as he said softly, "I've always wanted to pluck your eyes out." Fontaine stepped back in fear as he wondered if he was about to lose his life. But before Dion could take another step, an alarm sounded, halting his movements. He swiftly turned, heading for the door, and Fontaine was certain that the alarm had saved his life. The Pedelian knights stormed the mansion. The Agrease Knights panicked, for they'd already had a lot to deal with, such as putting out random fires. They shouted out for reinforcements, and the Pedelian Knights rushed forward, intent on attack, as one Agrease Knight recalled something he'd heard in the hallway. Master Fontaine had sent all Agrease troops away. They were defenseless. Cassis reminded his second-in-command, Isidore, that they weren't there to slaughter the Agreases because their objective was to find Lant Agrease troops. And he, as second-in-command, relayed the message in a loud shout. Mayhem further ensued as the monster hatch was open and vile creatures slithered out. Cassis slayed a monster in the midst of attacking a knight, and, in a mild voice, said, "Tell me, where is Lant Agrease?" Inside the annex, they anxiously asked Griselda the reason for their gathering, but she silenced them with a hand as she explained that if they wanted to live, they were to remain still. The servants found themselves standing within an intricately woven magic circle. Griselda gazed out of the window at the chaos, and she was sure that once the barrier broke, more madness would follow. Jeremy had heard of the alert about the intruders as he'd made his way to the annex, and he sighed at having more idiots to deal with. But soon the bright blaze caught his attention, and he dropped the servant, Roxana only on his mind, for she was in the very building that had been set alight. Jeremy made a mad dash for the building, dagger in hand, hoping his sister was safe as he took out the approaching Pedelian Knights with ease. And in under a matter of seconds, he walked away unscathed while the knights were left with fatal wounds. He took in the scene before him, but soon he looked up as what appeared to be red snow that fell from the sky. All fighting ceased as the knights looked up confused, but Jeremy knew that it was Roxana's butterflies. And a moment later, the entire environment changed before their very eyes. They were no longer in the courtyard, but in a different place. But what was a look of confusion soon turned to horror as black holes began to swallow up the knights, and screams of fear filled the air. Jeremy watched anxiously and shocked as he wondered how Roxana had created an hallucination room. Lant trudged forward, the drag of his sword loud. He'd stolen a robe and the sword from one of the dead executors, and he wondered how they'd lost their lives. He knew that Griselda had betrayed him as well as she was the only one capable of casting magic circles, and he wondered just how many of his children had double-crossed him. And so he vowed to end all of them. He would start over, he decided. He would hide in the secret pathway until help arrived, and then he would kill every one of them. He looked up at the approaching figure and stopped as he said his son's name aloud, Dion. Dion remained silent, and after a moment, Lant removed his robe as he told his son that he would have forgiven him had he begged for forgiveness. Dion darted forward, and his sword struck against Lance, who had drawn his just as fast. Lant knew that this fight was to be to the death. Dion jumped away, and he landed a distance away as Lant called him stupid for falling for nothing but a little girl's tricks. His glove fell to the floor, and soon Dion went on the offense as he attacked Lant, but Lant easily blocked Dion's attacks, for he was the one that had taught him everything Dion knew. He struck Dion just as fast, and soon his sword sat poised at Dion's throat, ready to deal out the killing blow. "You owe me your life," he said to his son. Dion still had yet to utter a word as he clutched at his bleeding head, and his silence angered Lant. But Lant wasn't surprised at the devious grin on Dion's face, who seemed to enjoy the thought of fighting to the death, for Lant had enjoyed taking his own father's life as well. Fontaine had somehow broken his chains and escaped from the underground dungeon. Fury rolled through him as he thought about everything that had happened to him. He vowed to return with his own troops, and he would kill both Lant and Dion. He recalled the pitiful look Roxana had thrown his way, now all an act he knew, and he vowed to take her life too. He opened the door ready to leave, but a sharp pain in his chest had him looking down. He stared at the protruding sword in confusion, but soon fell to the ground in agony as the sword was ripped out from behind. The voice behind him had him looking up despite the pain as they noted that he wasn't Lant Agrease. Fontaine took in the familiar silver hair and gold eyes. The same boy he'd seen at one of the banquets he recalled stood before him. The blue Pedelian heir. But Fontaine was uncertain as to how the blue heir stood before him when Roxana had killed him years back. And instead of choosing to fight, he knew he was too weak and wouldn't win, so he gave Cassis the information he wanted. He told Cassis that Lant had escaped the dungeon before he did, and Dion had chased after him a few moments ago. He could follow Dion to find the whereabouts of Lant. He told Cassis that he'd find his second enemy, Roxana. Fontaine believed this to be true, as he was sure Cassis had been tormented while he'd been Roxana's toy. Cassis was silent for a moment before he recalled the words Fontaine had said about taking Roxana's life. Fontaine nodded eagerly. Sure, they'd had a common enemy, but Cassis had other thoughts as he pulled out his sword once more, with the intention to end Fontaine. Fontaine was shocked by Cassis's words, for he'd never had any personal altercation with the Blue Heir. But the look in Cassis' eyes spoke volumes. For it was not a righteous Pedelian that now stood before him, but it was a threat from a man in love. And that was how Fontaine lost his life. Sierra rushed after the maid, still in a state of shock at the sudden appearance of Roxana's attendant. After she'd composed herself, she'd bombarded the attendant with questions about Roxana, but all the attendants had said was that Roxana had ordered her to assist Sierra in her escape from the estate. Sierra had been shocked to say the least, as the attendant had stated that the estate would soon disappear, but she'd not elaborated on that since. Sierra had grown hysterical as she'd worried about Roxana, and after a moment of silence, the attendant had stated that Roxana had already fled the estate, and Sierra was to meet up with her if she accompanied the attendant. And that was how Sierra had wound up following the attendant. She nibbled on her nails, nervous, and Sierra's maid assured her they would escape safely. But Sierra was too consumed with her worry for Roxana to pay the maid any mind. The scent of smoke wafted in the air, and the attendant turned to Sierra as she urged them to hurry, but a loud explosion erupted, drawing their attention. Roxana's attendant stepped forward as she took a defensive stance, and she unwrapped her hands. Smoke impaired the vision, but a moment later, Dion glided through the air, but a quick glance to the side and his eyes met Sierra's.